Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about upleveling leaders with current conditions, matching mindsets and methods for the needs of modern workforces, enabling employee and non-employee talent to apply their augmented skills over the long term and for specific project needs. Companies are becoming more agile to respond to marketplace developments. Businesses are becoming more distributed to better reach and serve customers. Work is becoming more flexible to adapt to changing demands. Workforces are becoming more blended to bring together talent with the necessary skills and experience for particular tasks and projects. And leaders are needing to be more empathetic to integrate and engage teams that span generations, locations, and employment arrangements in flatter, decentralized, digitalized organizations. I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Kelly Monahan, Managing Director at Upwork's Research Institute. Her research has been recognized and published in applied and academic journals. Kelly is the author of How Behavioral Economics Influences Management Decision-Making, and her new book, Essential: How Distributed Teams, Generative AI, and Global Shifts Are Creating a New Human-Powered Leadership, is coming out in January 2025. Hi, Kelly. How are you?
So great to see you, Sophie. I'm doing great.
Fantastic. So listeners know that I always start at the beginning, and you studied business administration and marketing and then went on to add an MA in strategy and business leadership and then moved on to a Ph.D.
So I did my undergrad in a classic business administration program, got my bachelor's of science, and I loved my education and its emphasis on technology because I went to RIT, but I felt like there was a human element missing. I was being swayed by a lot of people to go get a classic MBA program, but as I looked at the coursework, I realized so much I had already done in undergrad, and I was actually more curious about the psychology of people at work. And I had my first job out of college, and I was like, this cannot be the way that people actually lead. Like, this felt so not human. And so that's why I went more in the direction of strategic leadership and organizational behavior, was because I really wanted to understand, how do we get the environments and leadership right at work? I don't think people are the problem. I think it's often the institutions they're walking within. I'm more of from the Edward Deming school of thinking, where you can put really good people into a bad system. And a lot of times we think it's people, wherein oftentimes we can tweak the system. I think we can get people to do the right things.
It's interesting because you actually studied leadership, where even in an MBA program, which I did, we're not taught how to lead. So I think whilst people aren't the problem, we don't help ourselves by training ourselves to get there. You did organizational diagnosis, HR, research and analysis, organizational theory. These are really interesting. The combination of business and people is fascinating to me. What were the key things that you got out of that? And your particular interest was dyadic leadership.
Yes.
I would love you to go more into that.
It really became fascinated with leadership because I felt, just based on my own lived experience as, someone in their mid-20s trying to navigate corporate America, that just something felt broken in the way that we were leading. And to your point, I think MBA programs are really great at getting people to learn how to administrate and plan and organize resources, not so much when it comes to the people element. And so I saw some of those just really, classic good practices fail in action, especially when it came to engaging. I'm part of the, I like to say, elder millennial workforce, but, kind of a workforce coming up asking leaders to lead differently. So in my PhD program, I had this notion, as I started researching human resource development, that it was all about classic HR, pay, benefits, compliance. But in reality, so much of the learning and research was around the psychology of how people actually learn. How do you get adults who are their prefrontal cortex of their brain is fully developed to actually act in ways that are going to benefit the organization. And my big learning that I took from this program is that the majority of our business foundations and philosophy are built on this one assumption, that people inherently do not want to work and that people are lazy. Yes, that is the majority. You can look it up in the 1970s. It was actually out of the U of R. It's called agency theory. And so that is how really we've equipped leaders and managers, is just with that fundamental assumption. Where in the organizational psychology classes that I was taking was, well, what if people inherently did want to work? What if people were not as self-interested as we presume in a lot of our economic models? And instead that people, as much as they're self-interested, they're as much motivated to want to help people and work on behalf of others and take pride in that.
And loving goals and achieving something.
Goals, exactly. Finding meaning and identity. And so that's where the majority of my studies have focused on, is on that latter side of the discussion of taking the assumption that the majority of people inherently do want to work. Right. And we need to fix the systems so that they're actually appealing to the intrinsic motivations that are the goodness of mankind, not necessarily this self-interested, addicted to performance and competition in the way that we wire the majority of our organizations today.
It could also be seen as being self-interest, because if I am driven by goals and achievement, whatever, it's still in my own interest to do that. In between times, you were a media planner before your Ph.D. and a media manager. You went into marketing and decided not so much.
I love that you're going, most people don't know this about my career. So yes, I graduated in time during the financial crisis. So it was really difficult the labor markets were probably somewhat similar to what we're seeing today, to be honest with you. And so I got a job at a marketing organization, but as a media planner, my primary job was actually around numbers and statistics. So I was trying to understand from an advertising perspective, what was going to be the optimal media mix to get the most amount of eyeballs, whether that's on television commercials, billboards, some of the old-fashioned ways that we were advertising back then, radio ads. And so my job was really understanding customer behavior and population, and then optimizing the media mix on behalf of our clients. So it's funny, even though it was a quote-unquote marketing job, it was very much my entry into statistics, and really became a researcher as a result of that. So I really feel like I've been a researcher my entire life.
Sure.
I started off more on the consumer side and very quickly pivoted toward the workforce side.
You start into HR, but then quickly go to Deloitte and starting to do research on the future of work. I know that during that period, there was some amazing research on the future of work coming out of Deloitte. This was starting in 2015. The future of work was very much alive. I was already in workplace flexibility 2011, but the future of work I noticed as a term in 2015. What were some of the things that you were seeing then, driven by technology and the disruption that was happening?
Yeah, I'm so curious to see if this resonates with you and whether or not you agree, because I feel like the conversation that's become mainstream today is the exact same conversation at Deloitte we're having in 2015 and likely the conversation you were having in 2011. And so it's funny how long this has taken to really speed up. I really attribute so much of my foundational understanding of the future of work to my time as a researcher at Deloitte. I got the chance to work with some of the very best researchers, and I learned very quickly how to create research that was going to appeal to leaders. Because it was Deloitte, we had access to all of the Fortune 100 CEOs. And we started by just asking the question, what is keeping you up at night? And we kept hearing this term, future of work, during these interviews. And we thought, wow, this is an interesting term. How do we actually, again, as researchers, create a construct, something that we can actually measure from this? And through those interviews, we found 3 themes that were keeping executives up at night. The very first was, how does my work become more distributed? We knew physical proximity of work was going to change. And in many cases, this was actually being driven by manufacturing and supply chain, who wanted to move their locations of work further away from their headquarters to actually get more localized to their customers. And so this idea of distributed work was popping up as a key theme, not necessarily in the ways that we're talking about it today, which was certainly part of it, but was actually driven much more in a manufacturing supply chain way.
Interesting.
So we started modeling, how is work going to change as it no longer is tied to location? The second thing was, leaders were asking us, we need to have a much more flexible and agile workforce. We need to be able to scale up and scale down. How do we, and the term they were using at the time is, how do I think about talent off my balance sheets? How do I begin to create cultures that are inclusive to this type of talent so that they're motivated? I know they're not working for me only. So how do I create the best freelancer contractor experience so I'm getting the best of this skilled talent pool? So that was the second thing, was where you work was changing, who you're working alongside with was changing. And then the third topic, which we're talking still so much about today, is artificial intelligence. And at the time in 2015, it was a very fear-driven conversation. If you look back at a lot of the headlines, which was how quickly is AI or some version of automation going to take away jobs? And so we began to do extensive analysis at the task level at the time, really using AI as it existed in 2015, of what could be automated. So what work was going to change, who the workforce is changing, where they're working is changing, and what they're working on is changing. And that was the construct we came up with and began to organize our entire research program around those three themes.
There was also something that came through, particularly Deloitte research then, which was how technology, which was driving almost all of this,
totally
was changing the nature of work. That work was no longer linear and static. There was so much more non-routine work because so much of the routine work was being automated away. And also because technology was moving so fast and customers changing behaviors and competitors were taking on more technologies. And so it was much less predictable, and we were having to work across silos in multidisciplinary teams, which is later where I came to focus on empathy, because we're actually having to work more closely together, which we hadn't been before. Were some of those things also threading through the research that you were doing? Because that was something that really jumped out at me as being part of the additional people part of those three elements you talked about.
Yes, and that's a great nuance that you picked up on. Absolutely. So as we at the very high level, we're focused on those three themes. To your point, underneath all of that was the way that we begin to collaborate in a digital environment. I think you're 100% correct. It is 100% because of technology today that's driving the majority of these changes. And again, what we were focused on at Deloitte was we were surprised that so few leaders knew how to lead a distributed workforce. Very few leaders were equipped to actually manage a cross-functional team where they no longer had direct reports actually reporting into them, but had a lot more dotted line. And this loss of formal hierarchy and formal authority was very much something that we were beginning to study because, again, it was new for leaders. We have talked and given lip service a lot about leaders being influential, but at the end of the day, they could still very much manage through the hierarchy of their organization. This new way of working was requiring a completely new muscle, which makes perfect sense of how you got into empathy, because that is becoming the true power skill today of how people lead. It's not through a formal structure. It is through their ability to empathize and move people to move in a direction they otherwise wouldn't.
And it came through the decentralized workforces because I talked to leaders who had clearly trying to lead people in exactly the same way when they were out of the office. And that must have been very interesting as you're starting with that leadership emphasis from your academic studies in terms of how you were interpreting and looking through to the future and how that was going to be molding and influencing leaders, right?
Yeah. So I think what was so interesting for me, having a bit of a different background than maybe the traditional business administration all the way up through my Ph.D., was that from a leadership theory. So I studied a lot of leadership theories, and a lot of leadership doesn't actually derive from business environments. Leadership, the majority of theories actually derive from a military environment. Sure. And militaries are inherently distributed. And so there was so much more, I think, from a nuanced perspective that I thought was commonplace in business because of the way that I had studied leadership and the way that government and military organizations were being run. And I realized, oh, wow, we've got a mismatch right off the get-go, because as we start talking about whether it's transformational leadership or servant leadership or authentic leadership, all these different theories, they really didn't translate well into the business world because so much of it was actually still from a transactional, top-down driven approach, who still thought very linear about the process and supply chain. And so it was just fascinating to me to realize, wow, we're so far behind in the business world when it comes to leadership.
Yes, I feel like there's a disconnect. A couple of times I was being interviewed by ex-military. Leadership is always all about your team and trying to understand your team and empathizing with your team. And I was blown away because I think somehow in the translation of command and control from military to business, the empathy piece of it somehow got left out? Yes. I don't know, right?
It's a brilliant insight that you have there, because I agree with you, and I'm going to make a pretty bold statement. In some ways, there's probably a lot more emphasis in the military on empathy and teaming. I mean, talk about the most altruistic act that you have to do is a true line of service there. And so to your point, something got very lost in translation of how we inherited that model in the business world.
You moved to Accenture, more obviously in talent leadership. You were actually at Accenture when the pandemic hit. How did that shift how people were thinking, how people were needing to be engaging with particularly distributed work, but also leadership under crisis conditions?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So I moved to Accenture. I was working directly with the CHRO there, Ellen Shook, and Julie Sweet, who was the CEO. And I was compelled to go over to Accenture because they were beginning to come up with this new framework that they were calling Net Better Off. And so, again, it was really appealing to me as a researcher and also just as a human being, realizing their people first emphasis and realizing that they had to find a way to measure this, just like we do in the customer service approach. So we have a net promoter score. Why don't we have the same thing for employees and, over time, hopefully freelancers? And so that is what drew me over. And I didn't realize it at the time of how much luxury we were sitting in. I mean, our biggest concern as we were talking to CHROs at the time was around engaging their workforce, trying to figure out how do I engage my workforce, which is a very important question. But we were living, unbeknownst to us, in such a time of abundance. Right. There hadn't been a real crisis, in many years. There was decades, like a true decade of just abundance in the stock market and capital. Cash was cheap. And so we were operating in this environment, and that's where we were studying. How do we actually create people net better off? And it was, it was fascinating. I was going to be on stage with Ellen Shook, and David Rodriguez, who is the CHRO at Marriott, was our key partner on this research study. He also has a PhD in IO psychology. And so we were the day before the country shut down, we were headed to Orlando, Florida to go present our big findings on really, we felt really compelled to let people know and executives, we have got to get this net better off model right, because you're going to start losing talent. It's too abundant of a market right now. If you really want to get this right, here's the 6 dimensions. And obviously everyone was diverted to go back home, and we didn't do that presentation. And it was so fascinating for us, though, as a research team and being able to work with those executives, because we got to stress test that model in a time of crisis. So we went back out in the field and said, okay, we thought this model was solid. We think it's reliable. What happens now if the whole world's upside down? Are these 6 needs still critical? And we began to longitudinally test that over time, over the next year, to figure out which of the dimensions matter most to people. Do we see any changes? And so in some ways, I know. And so the headline there, I should go still drive people to that research report. It's out there, Net Better Off. The report's called Care to Do Better. But what we found is that in times of abundance, what matters most is your relational needs and your emotional needs, and then what we saw happen during the crisis, the pandemic, was financial needs began to rise to the top as people became displaced for their job. We also saw emotional needs continue to spike because of the emotional and mental needs. And then what was so fascinating, we saw as the pandemic hit, this sense of community and connection actually grow stronger, but then slowly dissipate as people started to realize this wasn't a 2-week thing. This wasn't a 3-month thing. As we persisted on, we began to see those relational needs really suffer as people were continuing to navigate this new world of work. And so, what we realized, we thought these were fairly stable needs, but the reality is they're really dynamic depending on what is happening in the world around us. What are people most concerned about right now? I saw a recent headline today. It's much more around job security.
Oh my goodness. And it's so fascinating, obviously in very, very difficult situation, but to be able to understand what people are going through and what some of their greatest needs are so that they can be sharing that with companies. We're still in the pandemic when you get to Meta at the end of 2021. And then 2021 was a challenging year. People thought we were going to be coming out of it, but we weren't quite. Yeah. A big company that also during the period you were there went through, yes, we're going to be totally flexible, and then perhaps not so much. How was that evolution there? Because that was one of the companies that was trying to respond to employees' needs, but then also there was clearly some friction there.
Yeah. So I went to Meta because I've always loved technology. And, as I think through, and again, like knowing the space I was in 2015, I was kind of eager for the next future of work conversation. And so the appeal of is VR and augmented reality the next wave for knowledge workers is what drew me there. And I thought, okay, well, I haven't researched this yet. How does human behavior change as we start meeting each other as digital avatars as opposed to people in person and then through Zoom? So I was there and I was hired as their very first future of work researcher. And I had the amazing opportunity to work with Alexis Fink, who runs the entire people analytics organization there.
Oh, fascinating.
And what was fascinating to me, I had grown up in Deloitte and Accenture, and so distributed work was inherent to their consulting models.
Right.
I guess I had failed to realize that the tech industry was so tethered to a location and place. So much of their success, and like if you think through from a culture perspective, their stories they tell in their narratives are all about the overnighters that they worked together and ordered pizza and got in the trenches together. And whether that's healthy or not, that's just the reality of how the Bay Area started and grew up. And so much of the success has been attributed to that in-person connection. And what I admired about Meta and why I went over there as well was that they were trying to figure out how do we use data and analytics to help guide what the next workforce strategy should be for our people. And so I got to study at the ground up really this transition they were making from in-person to distributed. What was that going to look like? How do they think about leadership norms? What's going to happen to early career professionals? How do they rethink through their boot camp?
And onboarding, right.
Onboarding, all of it. So I went from this consulting privilege of being able to work with organizations and study organizations, but not actually have to solve the problem. I wanted this experience to really get my hands dirty and see firsthand in a confined context, what are the real friction points? What are the barriers that leaders have to overcome? And it was really difficult. They still have remote work, but they have moved back to a more on-site strategy. And again, I think it's partly in just the way that their DNA operates and works. I think what's going to be interesting, and this is something that they're continuing to focus on, is the majority of talent today is no longer residing in the Bay Area in the way that it was before the pandemic. If we're going to be honest, the best talent has always been distributed. Talent is not discriminatory, and it shows up in all of us across the globe. And so I think it's going to be interesting as they continue to need more AI engineers and as they continue to move more in their metaverse strategy, whether or not there's simply enough engineers and talent that exist in that small radius to actually continue to remain competitive. And I think time will tell on that one.
I am imagining, as a techie semi-nerd researcher, Ready Player One. So metaverse, studying in the future, what do you think? I know that you've seen it, and I know you've read the book too, right?
Yes, you know me well, and even the short period of conversation. And I love that you know the book, and
that was a great
movie was fantastic. So that was my fear, is that technology itself is benign, but if we continue to glorify technology at the expense of our physical resources and physical environment, that was going to create a Ready Player One potential. And like, obviously to the extreme, but sometimes sci-fi movies actually give us a glimpse into what's ahead in the future. And it's the way that the decisions we're making right now as leaders of what to do with that technology and how to design it, that actually are going to dictate the next 10, 15 years. That was actually one of my motivations, was to try to understand how are people thinking about this? How are they designing this? The one thing I really appreciate after spending a lot of time in Meta Horizon workrooms is they are really obsessed with how do you bring social presence into a digital environment? And I think that is the right question to be asking, of how do we make sure that we're actually maintaining our human qualities and making that connection. And then I do think an equally important question is how do we make sure that we're not doing so at the expense of our physical planet and our resources, and that our physical environment is as appealing and as people are being drawn to as our digital environment. And that's going to be a tension that I think is going to continue to play out over time.
To that, just because that has been your focus, I did feel that the educational environment for listeners, the protagonist in Ready Player One goes to school online in the metaverse. And it did feel that he was getting a good education, maybe not one feels like a very human environment, but he did have a lot of connection, and with haptic materials, he was able to have good relationships. So my question to you is, as collaboration virtually becomes more normal, do you see some of that ability for us to be creating different, but the same level of social connections and collaboration in slightly different ways that is almost on par, if not on par, with in-person interactions and collaboration?
Yes, I'm actually very bullish on that. I think I'll just tell you just a quick anecdote of why I am. So I was in testing one of the workrooms, and I worked on a distributed team while I was at Meta. And we were all showing up on a meeting to, again, kind of move off Zoom, move off some of the fatigue, and just experiment with the new way of meeting. And it was the person next to me felt so real. Even though he wasn't there, he felt as if he was in my personal space. And I had to say, John, I need you to move over. And he's like, Kelly, I'm not in this room. I'm like, but you are. Like, you feel like you are, and you're invading my personal space. And so it kind of became a joke because that presence actually began to feel very real.
Interesting.
And for me personally, I actually was beginning to feel much more energized coming out of those meetings because, again, technology still has a long way to go, but even just being able to see more of the person, even if they're showing up as an avatar, being able just to interact with them, and with the new technology too, you can sense eye movement. And so again, being able to capture some of that, you can see whether or not someone was engaged, paying attention. It was just so much better, and having just a different mode of connection. So yeah, I'm very bullish. I think we're going to continue to get that right over time. And I actually think it's going to democratize access to learning, in particular in ways that aren't. But again, it comes with a trade-off cost. Like, we just have to make sure that the investment in our physical presence and our physical education and systems are as advanced as what we're creating in the digital side.
Thank you. Some great experience to imagine where things are going.
Yes.
Why did you move to Upwork? And there's so much that I'd like to discuss with you about the blended workforce, the extended talent pool. Back in Deloitte's at that time, exploring something that was keeping CEOs up at night.
Yeah.
Where had that got to by the time you got to Upwork?
Yeah, so it was so fascinating to me. Again, so much of our decisions are based on our own lived experience. So when I was at Meta, I wanted to bring in, I wanted to bring in Upwork because we were doing these research projects that I needed skilled talent that didn't make sense to have a full-time employee do, but I needed really niche expertise to come in, whether it was on a data analytics side or a natural language processing side, to help me accelerate my research agenda there. And it was just so difficult to bring in freelancers and contractors. And I realized, wow, this is such a real world barrier of accessing talent. I'm getting so excited about the metaverse and what's going to, the meetings. And I foresee that happening in the next, let's call it 7+ years out time horizon. Today's urgent need, is to help leaders begin to realize that there's really skilled outside talent that they need to learn how to capture and create the processes and leadership styles and environment to actually bring in this talent in order to continue to navigate the turbulent times we were in. And so for me, the reason why I made the move to Upwork is this is a here and now issue. If organizations don't get this right in the next 7 years, I'm not sure they're going to survive. And so I felt like the runway was much longer from a technology perspective than the people side is today, which is what led me to Upwork.
I have talked about this with Stefan Casriel when he was at Upwork, and he was in agreement with me then. And I wonder if any of your research or some of the trajectory since 2019 has changed in terms of where we are going. Companies with smaller core full-time employees and much bigger blended network, that extended talent pool with dotted lines on the outside of the company, with freelancers who come back and forth, part-timers, sometimes they're full-time, sometimes they're not. There's a much bigger pool of people who are coming and going depending on needs, which works for them as well as the company. I see Kelly nodding. Anticipating that, how far out might that be? There are the technical, the logistical, and these leadership needs. Where are we on all of those different parameters?
Yeah, it's such a great question, which is why I was nodding my head. I think as I think through the time horizon of organizations becoming much more fluid, and to your point, their talent mix shifting from these really almost bloated full-time core models into more agile, I think that time is in the next 2 to 3 years. And the reason why I'm saying that is as we think about what has happened in the tech industry alone. So we saw customer demand change significantly during the pandemic, especially in platform-based economies. And we saw this massive spike in hiring at my former employer, Meta being one of them.
Right.
But almost all technology companies really began to hire almost relentlessly and without caution. And then what happened is, as customer demand has pivoted and changed, it has, obviously it's substantially changed from pre-pandemic norms, but it's entered a new norm of how people are behaving.
Right.
And so they are returning to the grocery store, or they are returning to offices. And some of that demand has obviously fluctuated. And I think what really left a bad taste in Gen Z's mouth in particular was seeing that mass layoffs occur, of how quickly companies could scale up and how quickly they could then lay off. And I think that had been normalized for all the wrong ways, I think, of doing business in a way that doesn't feel like that's being normalized today, especially by the upcoming generation. I mean, you think about what they've been doing on TikTok. I mean, recording some of these layoffs and firings. I mean, the visibility and the transparency we now have to see what's happening, it is profound. And so because of that, I think leaders are realizing, and we have some new research coming out that I'll tease out here on this podcast, is that innovation before occurred, as we were talking about before, ping pong tables, getting people to come to these offices, work really long hours, and really there no budgets, just spend what you need in order to get the product out. I think the next wave of innovation is going to come from a much more disciplined approach of how companies are organizing their talent in particular, and beginning to really right size the mix that they need. Skills, and I know this from my research at Deloitte, skills change too quickly to continue to keep a really large full-time core up to date. It's nearly an impossible task. But what Deloitte has found, what obviously we found at Upwork Research, is that freelancers tend to be at the bleeding edge of their skilling. They know they have these niche skills. They have to. When your livelihood depends on it, you make the time to upskill and learn. And we're seeing that with generative AI as being the most recent use case. Freelancers are much more ahead of this technology curve. They don't have, like so many organizations today have limitations and restrictions, maybe rightfully so for their business model, but even restricting the access to these new generative AI tools to their employee population. Freelancers don't have that. They have full access. They don't have the bureaucracy that many full-time employees are navigating. And so what we found in our recent research is that full-time employees are struggling keeping up with the demands of their organization because they're doing more with less today. And they're just not feeling as comfortable with the generative AI tool the way that freelancers are. Freelancers say they have no problem keeping up with client demands. They have no problem using the new technology. And so their ability to come in and out, I think, is the way of the future. It has to be the way of the future because of the relentless pace of skill changes. We need to find a new work model. This isn't working for organizations and it's not working for people, which is why I'm so bullish on having the core get smaller so that people can really work to their expertise. It's good for business and it's good for the individual.
There's a question where the burden lies in terms of the upskilling. Is it the government? Is it private enterprise? Or is it the individual? And my guess is that across all three of those would probably be a good idea, sharing that, but it's moving at such a pace. And obviously that depends on the different country in terms of how much the government steps in or provides support for those programs. But right now, the people who are investing most in themselves are the freelancers or the 1099 folks in the US. I am also bullish about the greater utilization of the extended talent pool, because I do see that in the US, there is no job security. Younger talent who are worried about their financial security and trying to find some financial stability and having side hustles and all the rest of it, moving to a place where we have more stability and people do have many clients, they are not beholden to one, that does seem to be a better solution all around. Now we have a ways to go before that becomes more stable and the core is smaller. I'm intrigued that you think that's going to happen so quickly. So AI seems to be accelerating that because of this new skill spike.
Yeah, I think it's a couple things. I think as I look at zoom out in the macroeconomic economy, cash has gotten so expensive. And so companies are not as flush with cash as they were before, which is causing them to make different decisions as they think about moving forward. I think too, the reason why I'm bullish on that is because of the generative AI. How much is this actually disrupting work and at the task level itself, which is going to cause leaders to rethink, how do I actually really need to get this work done? Is it a full-time employee or is it really a combination of a freelancer and AI working together to get this work delivered? And so I think, what's getting in the way right now, though, is honestly what we're seeing in our research is the mindset of leaders. I mean, again, anyone who has gone through any sort of formalized management program or training, you start with the assumption of a full-time employee model. Like you don't even consider that there would be anything else out there. Mm-hmm. And I think what you said is so spot on. For so long, organizations had this allure based on really long-term incentives, whether that was pensions. I come from Rochester, New York, so Kodak country. Pensions, softball leagues, bowling leagues. There's really this community, and it was localized to attract workers. That model has just evolved, and it's no longer existing in the way it did in the 80s and 90s. And yet our leadership and talent and HR strategies have not kept pace with the way that the social contract has changed. And so when you ask the majority of Gen Zers today in particular and say, well, where do you find the more stability? Is it that one-to-one relationship, or is it the one-to-many? And the majority of Gen Zers are telling us it's the one-to-many is where they actually feel more stable and they feel more in control of their career. And I think at the end of the day, that's what we are wired for, a sense of control, autonomy. Right. And that's really being offered on the freelancer side. I think, even as I reflect on my career, I wish 20 years ago Upwork is where it is now, because I just even think through how I would structure my research career and maybe things I would have done differently. Because I even say the way that I've grown up in the last 15 years through corporate America, I'm not sure that same pathway exists to the same degree as it did. And I think the world has evolved. And so I'm even thinking through my research job is going to completely change because of generative AI. It already is in the way that I'm approaching my work, but it's going to continue to change. What I've learned a year ago is no longer even sufficient to keep me relevant today. And so I see myself beginning to take it. I mean, I work with more freelancers than I do full-time employees. Just to keep myself current and the Research Institute current. I mean, at the end of the day, if I'm going to be honest with you, I'm out there competing with the Deloittes and Accentures now, who have 300 plus research institutions. Right. We're a team of 3 full-time workers. But what I have at my disposal is worldwide expertise that I can bring in. So I'm bringing in the very best of the best to come and work with us on research projects that I think, with our research reports coming out, are just as good and on par with these larger organizations.
Apart from accelerating the arrival of the future of work, the pandemic has accelerated some other threads in this whole ecosystem, how the ecosystem has shifted. What are some of the other ones that you think are important to highlight here?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, leadership mindset, like the status quo and the way that we have equipped and trained organizational leaders, I think is doing us a disservice now. And so I think there's an urgent need to really rethink through a lot of our baseline assumptions around people at work and how that's changing. Again, like one of my good colleagues, Tony Buffin, speaks a lot about, we need to move from talent acquisition, which is all about, again, control of someone else. Like I own you almost, like this really bad mindset, to talent access, that I'm going to access your skills. And like even just that language shift, I think is powerful, because so much of what we have set up our institutions and organizations around has been this like very paternalistic, I will take care of you, but you're mine relationship. And that just doesn't bode well, right?
Well, it is how it used to be back in the 50s and 60s, right? It was the organization, capital T, capital O, that looked after you, had a job for life, and you put up with lots of long hours, and then you got to retire at the end. All of that's gone. And so it goes to my follow-up question to what you just said, which is this idea of the leadership, the mindset, and what that means also for how that leader is nurturing somebody who may be a full-time employee now. And also at times there's a different employment arrangement, and helping that person and so many younger employees take ownership of their career, take ownership of their development, and whether that's moving internally and externally and coming back at times. How are you seeing that evolve? Obviously, you have people who are freelancers all the time, and how some of their projects may be getting shorter or longer or more stable with particular organizations, as well as sometimes changing their employment arrangement. So it is a full or part-time rather than being a freelancer.
Yeah, I think so much of it has to come to how we actually view business. Again, like we're set up in a very competitive system, which I think is actually good for innovation and move the economy forward. However, I think we've confused people as part of that. I mean, even McKinsey famously came up with the war for talent. At the end of the day, these are human beings and people, and I don't think that's where the war should actually exist. I think that's really just poor language. But again, that's been the frame the majority of executives have been taught of. I'm in a war for talent. And when you have that mindset, it's very much a scarcity mindset. There's one individual that can, be gained or lost at any given time. But if you begin to move to a much more abundant mindset and said there's plenty of people and that they all have a variety of skill sets that I need at times, how do I make sure that I'm capturing the right person at the right time becomes the question. And that actually is a much easier question to solve for than it is, how do I keep this long-term relationship and keep this person happy and skilled? And so, and again, it's a scarcity versus abundance thinking is what this comes down to. And because we're dealing with people and human beings, is why I encourage much more of a collaborative ecosystem, abundant mindset as opposed to a scarce mindset. If you want to talk about moving goods and services around, I'm okay about talking about scarce resources and using economics for that. When it comes to human beings and the development of people, that to me requires a different mindset. And I think if organizational leaders would be okay with sharing some of these skill sets, I think we would have a different sort of labor market than what we see today.
And as you said, it's so much about language. When I have people in the organization, they're on loan to me. I will invest in them.
Yes.
And they're here for a portion of time, and then they will go on somewhere else. And that is part of their evolution. And if I think about it like that, it helps them bring their best work because I am there to help them succeed. And they will then also reciprocate and be helping the business succeed. These shifts are very important.
Yeah. And it's funny, something that just this triggered is I think NASA is actually a great example of this. I think in order to get us in that abundant mindset thinking is we have to ask and solve bigger problems than the majority of our organizations are solving.
Okay.
We have to start really, there's so many problems that are out there, customer needs, societal level problems, environmental problems, that businesses can actually be the force for good in helping solve a lot of this. And so as I think of NASA, they have this, they are truly living in the future. They have the smaller core utilizing agile talent models. They're very bullish on incorporating generative AI. And they really believe in crowdsourcing the best ideas. It's because their mission is so strong. They believe that they need the best of the talent in order to achieve their mission. And they have, this actually comes from the Navy, this disdain towards institutional arrogance. That over time you become so successful that you become arrogant and don't realize that a lot of the problems are now internal. And the only way to save and solve for that is by bringing in external talent and bringing in others who can help solve for this institutional arrogance that emerges. And I think that is like such a good example of a company that is really prioritizing solving a big problem and really realizing that they have rewired work to solve the problem. And I think that is like so inspirational for many of organizational leaders today. Instead of holding on to what is, ask a better business problem, ask a thornier problem that needs to be solved, and then figure out what's the right way to go solve for that.
Love that. How do you try and help leaders shift their mindset to be thinking more towards where we are, how we need to be thinking about people and work? How does work need to be done? And who's going to bring their talents in the best way possible to be able to do it?
Yeah. So, but two things I'm trying to do right now. As a researcher, I'm trying to do as much rigorous research to bring and illuminate this to life, where this is no longer just, it's the right thing to do. It's just the right business decision in order to survive the next 7 to 10 years. The past 6 months, we've had more bankruptcies declared in the US than we've seen since 2010. The lifespan in the S&P 500 has went from 67 years in the 1940s down to 15 years today. And so there's this need, there's, I think, a very urgent need to figure out how we're organizing business for survival. Because I think that threat is very real today in ways that maybe weren't 20, 30 years ago. So that's what I'm trying to do is tie these concepts and this new way of working back to business performance, so that we can make a very clear business case here of this is the right thing to do for people and your business survival. The second thing I'm leaning into is much more storytelling. and trying to listen. And again, you're the expert in empathy, but really beginning to realize that, okay, we have the sterile data. We can continue to show how P&L is changing. But the reality is, what are some of the human stories that need to come to the forefront to bring this to life? And so just doing a lot more listening, because to me, this seems so much like common sense at this point. After studying this since 2015, I'm just shocked that we're having the exact same conversations we were almost 10 years ago, even though there have been so many shining lights to show us we have to work differently. Pandemic, inflation, geopolitical crisis, like we've had a lot happen in the last 4 to 5 years that we're not responding to as business leaders fast enough. And that to me is what creates a really strong sense of urgency to figure out how do we make this so common sense to the rest of the world, and then they feel from their heart so compelled to act because of the human storytelling that we're doing as an institute.
One of the elements for me is that it goes to show how strong habits are. One thing that I would love to ask you to wrap up is, for leaders of organizations of any size, how can they better bring more non-employees into their organization to help be more nimble and be able to adapt to a very challenging and unpredictable market environment?
I think one of the very first things, and this is a hard thing to do in practice from an HR perspective, but as a leader or manager, we're still so wired at like the unit of analysis as we think through the flow of work is a job. And so when we feel, whether we feel understaffed or resourced, or there's a new project or someone leaves the organization, our gut reaction and just like our reactive way of working is, I need to go write a job description. But the reality is, you and I both know, like that job description is outdated the minute that goes online in post, let alone by the time you actually get someone in to start. But because of that way that we think about work, that's limiting us from seeing the possibilities here. Where again, if we said, okay, here's the problem I'm trying to solve for. What are the skills that I need? What is what is going to be best suited? Where can I incorporate AI as part of the solution? Where can I bring in skilled freelancers? What are those skills that I actually need? For how long do I need them for in order to achieve this project? And again, you see a lot of headlines about skills-based hiring, but I do think that's the real pivot that's holding us back from bringing in freelancers, and even seeing where AI is a possibility here too, is moving away from the job description that's static to skills that are much more dynamic in projects that need to be solved for. That shift alone has changed the way I lead the research institute, to be honest with you. I was wired very much, I need I ran large teams before coming here. I need all these researchers. And then what you're doing is you're scrambling, trying to keep them up to date and figure out what projects they want to work on. And you have this huge management overhead of all of this. Now I get to be much more of a researcher, and I get to ask better questions and work with much smarter people who are really fulfilled and can come in and out. And so again, I think about what are the skills I need to fulfill this project, as opposed to what's the job I need to get done.
Beautiful.
Perfect.
Kelly, thank you so much. Please send me some research links, because I know there's some great research that just came out about AI, about utilization of freelancers, but there's also other research that you refer to that can be very helpful as people think about work and talent differently, because I think that's where we are. So really appreciate all that you have shared. Fascinating journey that you've been on so far.
Thank you so much. Great to meet you. Take care.
You too.
Thanks again so much to Kelly Monahan, Managing Director at Upwork's Research Institute. You can find out more about Kelly on LinkedIn. Kelly's new book, Essential: How Distributed Teams, Generative AI, and Global Shifts Are Creating a New Human-Powered Leadership, is coming out in January 2025 and available for pre-order at smith-monahan.com. You can also find out more about Upwork and Upwork's research at upwork.com/research. You can also follow Upwork on X, Facebook, and Instagram at Upwork, UPWORK. Immediate action tip. Rather than thinking of a job when analyzing work, consider, what's the problem I'm trying to solve for? Then, what are the skills you need to achieve the project, and how can AI and skilled freelancers be incorporated as part of the solution? Please reach out to me if you would benefit from executive mentorship, as well as effective, empathy-centered programs to enable multi-generational company leadership, managers, and teams to up-level rapidly for modern work and whatever lies ahead. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, research and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.